Alright everyone, hey, Mr. Garhart here. We're going to do a little virtual tour of a couple things. We're going to look at the shrubland biome as well as some examples of succession. So I brought my little XJ out to Bangs Canyon, and it's a perfect example of shrubland. So let's look at the shrubland biome. So right by my Jeep here, you can see a perfect example of very disturbed land. So this would be the first stage of our succession, bare soil. Remember, this can happen due to a lot of different circumstances. We could have natural things like tornadoes or hurricanes come by, completely wipe out an area. A fire could do this. In this case, here in Bangs Canyon, right along the road, we have disturbance by humans. So we have bulldozed this, we've created the road, and then people are turning around and driving on this soil. So this is an example of bare soil, our first step in succession. So one of the primary pioneer species here in the Pinyon Juniper woodland is going to be cactus. Cactus will be growing wherever the land has been disturbed. And another example is going to be a annual grass, one that dies every year and then reseeds itself, called brome grass. So here's an example of a cactus that's going to be growing in this area. This is called prickly pear cactus, and you don't want to really get into it because it's got these really long stickers, and it's got lots of little stickers on the inside. It's kind of flat. This is a typical cactus. You can see it's growing along the side of the road here. And it will be a good pioneer species. It's very hardy. Remember, pioneer species are going to be those that are hardy weeds. They can handle a lot of stress. You're not going to get delicate flowers as a pioneer species. So this cactus is a great example of a pioneer species. Another good example is the grass that's growing right next to it. This is called cheatgrass, and cheatgrass is an annual grass. It grows really well in the spring. It'll green up. You can kind of see over here it's greening up. This is early spring here for us, but this cheatgrass is greening up in the spring, and then it dies before it gets too hot, and then seeds, and the seeds wait for the next year. So it's called cheatgrass because you think it's going to be green, but then it cheats you out of that and becomes a field of dead grass. Cheatgrass is also a invasive species. It tends to crowd out native grasses, and it was carried over in the 1800s by sheep. You probably know it best because cheatgrass is that grass that gets stuck in your socks when you go for a hike. Okay, so for the Pinyon Juniper woodland, all of this brush is going to be our primary succession. So primary succession, remember, the shrubs are going to start taking over and dominating over those pioneer species. And so in our Pinyon Juniper woodland here, that is a lot of sagebrush, rabbit brush, plants like that. So you can see in my view here, the road is going to be bare soil. Right next to the road is our pioneer species. And then just off the road is the primary succession, where we've got shrubs growing. Now in the distance there, the trees, those are pinyon and juniper trees. They're going to be our climax community, that's secondary succession. So one of the primary plants that are going to be growing in our primary succession is this plant right here. It is called greasewood, and it's pretty thorny. It's really hardy, and if you get into it, you have a big mess. It'll cut you up and ruin your day. Interesting thing about greasewood is that it was one of the few species to survive when they were doing nuclear testing in the 1950s. So this plant is really hardy. It's not a pioneer species, but it is growing in primary succession, and it's one of those shrubs. So you've probably come across greasewood if you've been hiking. Here is another native plant, yucca. Yucca is something that you can actually eat. Native Americans and indigenous people would make baskets and such out of yucca. But if you dig down, the roots of yucca are edible and are very starchy. So they give you lots of carbohydrates. Okay, let's drive on up into the climax community of our pinyon juniper shrubland. Okay, so here is our pinyon juniper climax community, and just like its name, it's predominantly two types of trees: juniper, which you see right here, and pinyon, which is a type of pine tree that's right here. So we usually call this pinyon juniper woodland. So this is our climax community. This is a stable community that can last thousands of years unless it gets disturbed. Once it gets disturbed, like the road here, so you can see our road is disturbed. My Jeep's sitting on disturbed land. If we let that sit for a number of years, it's going to undergo succession. You'll start getting cactus, grass, then some of the shrubs, greasewood. You might get some rabbit brush, you might get sagebrush coming in, and then over the course of time, the pinyons and junipers, like this little guy right here, they will start to grow. So our climax community is very stable. So here is western Colorado shrubland. So as I was walking around this climax community, I noticed something growing on these juniper trees. This is a juniper tree. If you look, there's this discolored plant growing right here on the juniper. This is mistletoe. I know you think of mistletoe as being that thing you kiss under at Christmas time, but this is a mistletoe that's growing on the Juniper. Now, mistletoe is a parasite. This plant is a parasite that is attacking the juniper. So anything that's a parasite is when one organism is taking advantage of another organism. So this mistletoe is growing to the detriment of the juniper tree. We think of parasites as being things like, worms and amoebas, but plants have their own parasites too. This plant is called Lomadium, and it's also a native plant. I was kind of excited to see it. It's already gone to seed, which is very interesting for being mid-April. But this plant is in the parsley family, and it usually only grows around rocky outcrops. One of my favorite butterfly caterpillars, the Indra swallowtail, eat this plant. So it's kind of neat to see it out here in Bangs Canyon. I've never seen the Indra swallowtail in Bangs Canyon, but its host plants here. Wow, so those guys in the Jeeps were a little bit crazy, a little too brave for my taste. I don't rock crawl with my little XJ. I just take it out on these 4x4 roads, but it's kind of cool to watch them try and get up those rocks. I don't think they were being very successful though. We should take note as we walk around in this area of the soil. If you notice, the soil is kind of bumpy and it's got black little towers to it. This is called cryptobiotic soil. It's actually a living soil. That's where the biotic part comes from. It has bacteria that are growing in amongst the soil, and they build these little towers. You want to try and avoid walking on them as a footprint will destroy this environment, and it can take hundreds of years for those bacteria to build up and re-stack their towers. So you should watch out for this cryptobiotic soil as you hike around in the Pinyon juniper woodland. These patches of very dark soil are not cryptobiotic. They are a lichen that's growing on the surface of the soil. A lichen is a symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungus. So the algae and fungus live together in harmony. We call it mutualism, and they will help each other. Unlike a parasite, these two organisms are helping each other to grow. So these lichens are growing on the surface, and then if you look over next to them, you can see all that cryptobiotic soil. Another nice little native plant is paintbrush. It's very pretty, blooms in the springtime, and you can see it looks sort of like a paintbrush. There are different varieties of paintbrush, but we have a nice vibrant red here in our Pinyon juniper woodland. Here's another interesting native plant. This is called Mormon tea. Mormon tea is a plant that was traditionally used for medicinal purposes. It contains a couple chemicals. It contains a chemical called ephedra. Ephedra is a chemical that when you ingest it, it makes you have to pee a lot. It's what we call a diuretic. Now, diuretics have medicinal purposes. Tea in general, if you just drink black tea is a diuretic. So if you're drinking a lot of black tea, you're going to pee more than normal because this chemical causes you to pee. Now, another thing that Mormon tea has is caffeine. And caffeine is a stimulant. It stimulates your heart to beat faster. And that's what keeps you awake when you drink something like coffee or a Monster. But this is why you also have to be careful when you're drinking those things, because caffeine, as a stimulant, it speeds up your heart, and that's why every once in a while people have heart trouble with caffeine. So another native plant to our biome here is going to be rabbit brush. Now, rabbit brush in the fall has really pretty flowers that are yellow, and they just cover the landscape. This is April, so we don't have any blooms until fall, but one of the characteristics of rabbit brush are these little bunny tails that are on the stems. Now, these little bunny tails are not part of the plant. They are what's called a gall. And if we open up the gall, it's hard to see, but inside is a little grub. It's actually a wasp larva. What happens is there's a species of wasp that lays their eggs inside the plant stem. So instead of having a stinger, the wasp has an ovipositor that sticks into the rabbit brush and lays its egg. Then that egg is protected throughout the winter. What happens and what makes these bunny tails is that the rabbit brush doesn't like the little wasp larva. It actually irritates the wasp larva. And so the wasp larva causes the plant to grow this bunny tail, this gall. And the plant's trying to protect itself from the wasp larva. And then the wasp larva is even more protected throughout the cold winter. And then that wasp larva will develop and then hatch out into a wasp and fly away. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed our tour of the Pinyon juniper woodland and our little review on succession. So